The snowstorm enveloped the Nevada wilderness in an unforgiving, blinding shroud. Bitter winds screamed through the skeletal branches of pine trees, carrying snow in swirling eddies that obscured the trail. Jake, a ranger hardened by years of solitude and survival in this harsh landscape, pulled his scarf tighter around his face as he trudged through knee-deep snow. The storm was merciless, and visibility extended only a few feet ahead of him. Every step was a battle against nature, his boots sinking into the drifts, the icy air biting his exposed skin. He heard it faintly at first, a sound so fragile it almost blended with the howling wind, a faint, pitiful whimper. Jake froze mid-step, his breath clouding in the frigid air as he strained to listen. There it was again, a faint cry carried by the wind, weak and desperate. It could have been mistaken for the wind itself, but Jake's instincts told him otherwise. He adjusted his headlamp and turned toward the sound, his heart pounding with urgency. "Hello?" he called out, his voice muffled by the storm. The cry came again, barely audible. Jake pushed forward, his legs burning as he climbed through snowdrifts, his eyes scanning the stark white landscape. The sound guided him, a fragile lifeline in the chaos of the blizzard. As he crested a small rise, his light fell on a small, trembling figure partially buried in the snow. It was a puppy, its tiny body barely visible against the endless white. The creature was curled into a tight ball, its fur matted with ice and snow. Its whimpers grew softer as Jake approached, each sound a feeble plea for help. His heart clenched at the sight. The puppy's ribs were visible through its thin fur, and its breathing was shallow. It was a miracle it had survived this long. "Hang on, little guy," Jake murmured, his voice rough with emotion as he knelt beside the animal. He removed his gloves, ignoring the immediate sting of the cold against his skin, and gently scooped the puppy into his arms. The tiny creature was alarmingly light, its body stiff from the cold, but a faint warmth still lingered in its core. Jake could feel the weak flutter of its heartbeat beneath his fingers, a fragile reminder that it was still alive. The wind tore at his jacket as Jake adjusted the puppy inside his coat, pressing it against his chest to share his body heat. The little animal whimpered softly but didn't resist, too weak to move. Jake stood, shielding the puppy as best he could, and began the arduous trek back to his cabin. The storm intensified, the wind whipping snow into his face and stealing the heat from his body. His muscles ached with exertion, and his footing slipped on the uneven ground, but he refused to slow down. Every step was a fight against the elements, every breath a sharp, icy pain in his lungs. The trail was nearly indistinguishable beneath the layers of snow, but Jake knew this forest well. He moved with grim determination, his arms cradling the puppy as though it were the most precious thing in the world. The storm seemed endless, an unrelenting force that sought to bury him, but Jake kept his head down and pushed forward. After what felt like an eternity, the faint outline of his cabin emerged through the swirling snow. Relief flooded through him, lending strength to his faltering steps. He staggered onto the porch, his boots crunching on the wooden planks as he fumbled for the door. Inside, the cabin was dark and silent, the only sound the muffled roar of the storm outside. Jake kicked the door shut behind him, sealing out the freezing wind, and hurried to the fireplace. The puppy stirred weakly in his coat, a soft whine escaping its lips. Jake wasted no time. He laid the tiny creature on a thick blanket near the hearth and quickly set to work building a fire. His hands trembled from the cold as he struck a match, and the flames sputtered to life, casting a warm glow that began to chase away the chill. He added more wood, coaxing the fire into a steady blaze, before turning his attention back to the puppy. It lay motionless, its eyes barely open, its small body shivering uncontrollably. Jake grabbed another blanket and wrapped it gently around the puppy, tucking it in close to the fire. He rubbed its sides briskly, trying to restore circulation, his hands moving with a mix of urgency and care. "Come on, buddy," he said softly. "Stay with me." Jake rummaged through his supplies, pulling out a small bottle of water and an old tin of powdered milk. He mixed a bit of the powder into the water and warmed it near the fire before filling a syringe he kept for emergencies. Kneeling beside the puppy, he carefully dripped the liquid onto its tongue. The puppy swallowed weakly, its tiny movements a sign of life that filled Jake with hope. Hours passed as Jake tended to the puppy, his own exhaustion forgotten in the face of its fragile existence. The storm raged on outside, the wind howling against the cabin walls, but inside, the fire burned bright. Slowly, the puppy's shivering began to subside, and its breathing grew steadier. Jake stayed by its side, watching over it like a sentinel, his heart willing it to survive. As dawn broke, the storm began to relent, its fury giving way to a quiet stillness. Jake sat slumped by the fire, the puppy now nestled in his lap, its tiny body rising and falling with each steady breath. He looked down at the little creature, a mixture of relief and determination in his eyes. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" he murmured. "We'll get through this together." The cabin was warm now, the fire crackling softly, and for the first time since the storm began, Jake allowed himself to relax. The puppy shifted slightly in his lap, letting out a soft sigh, and Jake felt a small, rare smile tug at the corners of his lips. In the midst of the storm's chaos, he had found something worth fighting for. Inside the warmth of his cabin, the howling blizzard outside seemed like a distant nightmare, though Jake's body still carried the storm's chill in his bones. The fire he had hastily built crackled and spat embers into the air, casting flickering shadows on the log walls. His hands trembled slightly, not from cold now, but from the weight of what he was doing. The puppy lay in the center of the cabin, swaddled in several thick blankets, its tiny body dwarfed by the layers of fabric. Jake knelt beside it, his knees digging into the rough wooden floor. The firelight revealed every detail of the little creature. Its fur, damp and matted from the snow, was patchy in places, as though it had suffered neglect or worse before being abandoned. He reached out, running a hand lightly over its frame. Beneath the blankets, the puppy's ribs jutted sharply, a testament to days, perhaps weeks, of starvation. The puppy let out a faint whimper as Jake gently rubbed its sides, trying to stimulate its circulation. Its eyes fluttered open briefly, two orbs of liquid brown full of fear and exhaustion. Jake's chest tightened at the sight. He didn't know much about dogs beyond the occasional hiker bringing one along on a trail, but even he could tell this pup had been through hell. "Stay with me, buddy," Jake muttered, his voice low and rough. He felt an unexpected pang of vulnerability. This little creature, so fragile and defenseless, had become his responsibility. And if he failed now, its life would end right here, inches from salvation. He hurried to the kitchen area, scavenging what he could from his meager supplies. There was no dog food, of course, but he found an unopened can of chicken soup. It would have to do. He warmed a small portion on the stove, carefully straining the broth and discarding the vegetables and chicken chunks. Returning to the puppy, he knelt again and used a spoon to dribble a few drops of the warm liquid onto its cracked lips. The puppy stirred, its head shifting slightly as its tiny tongue flicked out to lap at the liquid. Jake's heart leapt at the response. Encouraged, he continued to feed it drop by drop, murmuring soothing words as he worked. Slowly, its breathing became steadier, and the trembling that had racked its small frame subsided. Hours passed like this, Jake feeding the puppy, rubbing its sides, and adjusting the blankets to keep it warm. He barely noticed his own discomfort, his knees numb from kneeling, his back stiff from crouching over the makeshift bed. His focus never wavered. The fire in the hearth burned low, and he added more logs, coaxing it back to life. Outside, the storm raged on, but the cabin was a cocoon of heat and fragile hope. As dawn began to seep through the cracks of the curtains, Jake noticed something odd. The puppy's paw, sticking out from beneath the blanket, bore an unusual mark. He leaned closer, brushing the fur aside to get a better look. It was a scar, crescent-shaped and stark against the dark pad of the paw. The edges were jagged, as though it had been inflicted deliberately rather than by accident. Jake's stomach turned. He had seen scars like this before, not on animals, but on people. It was the kind of mark that spoke of cruelty, of someone intentionally branding or cutting to leave a permanent reminder. Who could do something like that to a defenseless animal? And what? His mind raced with questions, but there were no answers. He traced the scar lightly with his thumb, and the puppy whimpered, pulling its paw away instinctively. The The sound sent a pang of guilt through him. "Sorry," he murmured. "I won't hurt you." But the mark was burned into his thoughts now. It changed things. This wasn't just a stray dog abandoned in a storm. Someone had done this, someone cruel enough to leave it for dead in the middle of nowhere. Was the scar a mark of ownership? Or something else? Jake couldn't shake the sense that there was more to this little animal than met the eye. As the day wore on, the puppy began to show signs of recovery. It moved more, shifting beneath the blankets and lifting its head weakly to look around. Jake felt a tentative sense of relief. He watched as the puppy sniffed the air, its tiny nose twitching, and its eyes began to lose the glazed look of exhaustion. Jake set down a small bowl of water near the fire, watching as the puppy struggled to stand. Its legs wobbled beneath it, and for a moment, Jake thought it would collapse. But the puppy steadied itself and took a shaky step forward, then another. It reached the bowl and began to lap at the water, its tiny pink tongue flicking out with surprising speed. Jake couldn't help but smile. "You're tougher than you look," he said, leaning back against the wall. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly as he watched the puppy drink. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The bond between them grew quickly in those early hours. The puppy followed Jake with its eyes, its gaze full of quiet trust. Jake found himself talking to it as he worked around the cabin, sharing his thoughts out loud as though the little creature could understand him. It was absurd, he knew, but it felt natural. When the storm finally abated, Jake ventured outside to gather more firewood. The snow was piled high against the door, and he had to dig his way out with a shovel. The landscape was transformed into a frozen wasteland. The trees bowed under the weight of the snow, their branches creaking in the silence. He worked quickly, his breath steaming in the cold air, and returned to the cabin with his arms full of wood. Inside, the puppy greeted him with a wag of its tail, a slow, tentative movement that made Jake's heart swell. He crouched beside it, rubbing its ears and murmuring, "Good boy." But his thoughts kept returning to the scar. The more he looked at it, the more uneasy he felt. It wasn't just the shape of it, it was the precision. The scar was too deliberate, too purposeful. It wasn't the kind of injury a dog would get from an accident or a fight with another animal. Someone had done this. And that meant someone might come looking for the puppy. Jake shook his head, pushing the thought aside. For now, the puppy was safe. That was all that mattered. But the unease lingered, a quiet undercurrent to his thoughts. As he sat by the fire that evening, the puppy curled up beside him, he couldn't help but wonder what kind of trouble this little creature had already seen, and what kind of trouble might still be coming. As the blizzard finally released its grip on the forest, an uneasy calm settled over the snow-laden landscape. The howling wind had given way to an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creak of branches under the weight of snow. Inside the cabin, Jake sat by the fire, his hand resting on the puppy's small head. The pup had gained strength over the past day, its tiny body no longer trembling and its eyes brighter, more alert. Jake had done all he could for it, feeding it warm broth, keeping it close to the fire, and talking to it in the still hours of the night. The bond between them had solidified in those hours, forged in the crucible of survival. Yet, even as the puppy grew stronger, the crescent-shaped scar on its paw lingered in Jake's thoughts like an unspoken question. Who had hurt this animal? And what? The morning sun broke through the trees, casting long shadows across the snow. Jake stepped outside, his boots crunching through the fresh drifts, to check on his surroundings. The storm had left the world transformed. A pristine expanse of white, unbroken except for the cabin and the faint path leading into the woods. As he breathed in the frigid air, he heard it, a bark, distant but unmistakable. Jake froze, his heart thudding in his chest. The sound came again, sharper this time. It was followed by more barking, the voices of multiple animals blending into a chaotic chorus. Jake's eyes darted toward the tree-line, where dark shapes moved against the backdrop of snow. A pack of dogs. They were emerging from the forest, their forms growing clearer as they approached. At the head of the group was a massive animal, its fur a mix of black and silver, with eyes that gleamed like shards of ice. This alpha moved with purpose, its head held high, radiating authority over the pack. Behind it, smaller dogs followed, a mix of lean, wild creatures that moved as one, their breath visible in the cold air. Jake's first instinct was to retreat into the cabin, to bar the door and protect the puppy inside. But something held him back. The barking wasn't hostile. It was insistent, almost searching. And then Jake heard a sound behind him, a high-pitched, excited yip. The puppy! Jake turned to see the little dog scrambling toward the door, its tail wagging furiously. It barked in response, its tiny voice rising to meet the calls of the pack. Jake's stomach twisted. He stepped between the puppy and the door, his hand held out as if to stop it. "Wait," he said, his voice firm but uncertain. "What are you doing?" But the puppy was undeterred. It darted around him, slipping through the partially open door before Jake could stop it. It landed in the snow with a soft thump and began bounding toward the pack, its small legs struggling against the deep drifts. Jake hesitated for a moment, then followed, his boots crunching through the snow as he tried to keep up. The alpha dog had stopped at the edge of the clearing, its piercing eyes fixed on the cabin. The other dogs circled behind it, their movements fluid and coordinated. When the puppy reached them, it yipped excitedly, its tail wagging so hard it nearly knocked itself over. The pack seemed to respond as one. They crowded around the little dog, sniffing it, nuzzling it, their bodies forming a protective barrier around the smaller creature. Jake slowed his pace, stopping a few yards away. He stood there, his breath fogging in the cold air, as he watched the reunion unfold. The puppy was ecstatic, its tiny body wriggling with joy as it was welcomed back into the fold. The alpha leaned down, its massive head brushing against the puppy's in a gesture that was almost tender. Jake felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that the puppy wasn't alone in the world, but also a pang of something deeper. Loss? He had saved this little animal, nursed it back to health, and now it was leaving him without a backward glance. He told himself it was for the best. The puppy belonged with its pack, not cooped up in a cabin with a man who didn't even know the first thing about dogs. But the sight of the alpha stirred something else in Jake. The way it carried itself, the sheer power and intelligence in its eyes, it wasn't like any wild animal he'd seen before. This wasn't a stray group of dogs scavenging to survive. This was something different. Something organized. The scar on the puppy's paw flashed in his mind again, and Jake's unease deepened. As he stood there, the alpha's gaze shifted to him. Their eyes met, and Jake felt a jolt of something primal. A challenge, maybe, or a question. The dog's stare was unrelenting, cutting through the cold air like a blade. Jake held its gaze, unwilling to back down, though his heart pounded in his chest. The alpha took a step forward, and the other dogs fell silent. It moved slowly, deliberately, until it stood just a few feet from Jake. The man and the dog regarded each other, the silence between them heavy with tension. Jake didn't move, didn't speak. He felt like an intruder in his own world, a man out of his depth. Then, to Jake's surprise, the alpha dipped its head. Not in submission, never that, but in acknowledgement. A gesture of respect, perhaps, or a truce. Jake exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The alpha turned away, barking once, and the pack began to move, their bodies disappearing into the trees like shadows melting into the forest. The puppy trotted after them, pausing only once to look back at Jake. Its eyes, so full of life now, met his for a fleeting moment. And then it was gone. Jake stood there for a long time, the cold seeping through his boots, his hands clenched at his sides. He told himself he had done the right thing, letting the puppy go. It belonged out there, in the wild, with its family. But the cabin felt emptier now, the silence oppressive. The bond he had formed with the little creature had been brief but profound, and its absence left a void he couldn't ignore. As he turned to head back to the cabin, Jake's eyes fell on the snow where the pack had been. Their tracks crisscrossed the clearing, a chaotic pattern of movement. But one set of prints stood out, larger, heavier, deeper. The alphas. Jake stared at them, a sinking feeling in his gut. Those tracks weren't just big, they were too big. Larger than any dogs he had ever seen. A shiver ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He had heard stories, rumors passed between rangers about strange sightings in the wilderness, creatures that didn't quite fit the natural order. He had always dismissed them as campfire tales, exaggerated or imagined. But now, standing alone in the snow, he wasn't so sure. Jake turned back to the cabin, his mind racing. The crescent-shaped scar. The alpha's eyes. The pack's behavior. None of it added up. He had thought he was saving a helpless puppy, but now he wondered if he had stumbled into something much larger and much more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The days following the storm felt eerily quiet, almost as though the forest were holding its breath. Jake spent most of his time restoring the order disrupted by the blizzard, chopping firewood, clearing snow from the path around the cabin, and repairing the storm shutters that had groaned under the wind's relentless assault. But his mind was far from settled. He couldn't stop thinking about the pack of wild dogs, especially the alpha. Those piercing eyes haunted him, and every time he glanced at the fading tracks outside his cabin, a strange unease crept over him. The little puppy, too, lingered in his thoughts, the way it had bounded so joyously toward its pack, and the crescent-shaped scar on its paw. The storm might have passed, but Jake felt as if he were still trapped in its wake, a quiet tension hanging over him like a shadow. The third night after the storm, Jake was jolted awake by a sound outside. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or the rustle of trees in the wind. It was softer, more deliberate, like footsteps crunching through the snow. He reached for the rifle he kept by the door and peered out through the frosted window. At first, he saw nothing but the dark silhouettes of the trees, their branches stark against the moonlit snow. But then, movement, slow and steady, coming up the path toward the cabin. Jake's grip tightened on the rifle as a figure emerged from the woods. It was a woman, cloaked in a heavy, dark coat, the hood drawn up to obscure her face. In her arms, she cradled a bundle wrapped in thick fabric. The sight was so unexpected that Jake hesitated, his breath fogging up the window as he leaned closer to get a better look. Who could possibly be out here, miles from the nearest road or town, in the dead of winter? The woman stopped just outside the cabin, her head lifting slightly as though she knew she was being watched. Jake's unease deepened. After a moment's hesitation, he stepped back from the window and opened the door a crack, the cold night air rushing in and biting at his skin. "Who's there?" he called, his voice gruff and cautious. The woman raised her head, and Jake could see her face for the first time. She was striking, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to glint like amber in the moonlight. Her expression was calm but unreadable, as if she carried secrets too heavy to share. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice low and steady. "I mean no harm." Jake didn't move at first, his instincts screaming at him to be wary. But there was something about her, something in her tone or the way she carried herself, that disarmed him. Against his better judgment, he stepped aside, allowing her to enter. She brushed past him silently, her presence commanding but not imposing. Inside, the woman set the bundle she was carrying on the table, unwrapping it carefully to reveal its contents. Jake leaned closer, his curiosity outweighing his suspicion, and saw what she had brought: a small stone, smooth and dark, engraved with intricate, ancient-looking symbols. The patterns swirled across its surface like a language he couldn't hope to decipher. "This," she said, gesturing to the stone, "is why I'm here." Jake frowned, his eyes flicking between the stone and the woman. "I don't know what that is," he said gruffly. "And I don't know who you are." The woman's gaze didn't waver. "My name is Ela," she said. "And I've come because of the puppy you saved." Jake stiffened at her words. "The puppy? It's gone. It left with its pack." Ela nodded, as though she had expected this answer. "Yes, and that's as it should be. But you did something few people would have done. You saved a life that others had abandoned. And by doing so, you became part of something much bigger than yourself." Her words unsettled Jake. He didn't like the way she spoke, as though she knew more about him than she should. He crossed his arms, his voice hard. "What are you talking about?" Ela placed a hand on the stone, her fingers tracing the engraved symbols. "The puppy you saved is no ordinary dog. It belongs to a lineage of wild canines that have roamed these forests for centuries. They are not just animals. They are connected to this land in ways most people cannot understand. They are guardians, protectors of a balance that has existed long before humans settled here." Jake stared at her, the weight of her words pressing down on him like the storm that had battered his cabin days earlier. Guardians? He repeated, his skepticism plain. You're saying that pack is, what, magical? Special somehow? Hila's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. Call it what you will. But they are unique, and so is the pup you saved. That scar on its paw, it's a mark, a symbol of its role within the pack. And now, because you intervened, you've been drawn into their world. Jake shook his head, stepping back as if to distance himself from her and the stone. I didn't ask to be part of anything. I just did what anyone would have done. No, Hila said firmly. Most would have walked away. They would have seen a burden, not a life worth saving. But you didn't. And now, the pack has chosen you. The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. Chosen me? For what? To protect their legacy, Hila said, her voice quiet but resolute. The world is changing, Jake. These forests, this land, everything is under threat. The balance the pack preserves is fragile, and there are those who would destroy it for their own gain. You've seen it, haven't you? The scar on the pup, the size of the alpha, the way they move together like a single entity. They are more than what they seem. And they need someone to stand with them. Jake felt a surge of anger and disbelief. Why me? I'm just a ranger. I'm not some guardian or protector. Hila's gaze softened, but there was no pity in her expression. You may not see it now, but you have the strength to do this. You proved it when you carried that pup through the storm, when you risked your life to save it. They see something in you, something rare. Jake's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He didn't want this. Didn't want the responsibility she was trying to thrust on him. He had come out here to escape, to live a simple life away from the chaos of the world. And now this woman, with her cryptic words and strange stone, was asking him to step into something he couldn't even begin to understand. I'm not your guy, he said finally, his voice hard. Whatever this is, I don't want any part of it. Hila didn't flinch at his rejection. She simply picked up the stone and placed it in his hands. It was heavier than it looked, the engraved symbols warm against his skin. Whether you want it or not, she said softly, the choice has already been made. The question is whether you'll accept it. And with that, she turned and walked out into the snow, leaving Jake alone with the stone, the firelight casting shadows on the ancient symbols that now seemed to glow faintly in the dim cabin. The days following Hila's departure were a blur of restless pacing and sleepless nights. Jake couldn't shake her words, couldn't ignore the weight of the stone she had left behind. It sat on his table, the engraved symbols staring back at him, taunting him with their mystery. He had tried to push it all aside, tried to convince himself that her visit was nothing more than the ramblings of an eccentric woman. But deep down he knew better. The pack, the scar on the pup, the way the alpha had looked at him, it all pointed to something far beyond the ordinary. By the fourth night, he had made up his mind. He couldn't ignore it any longer. If the pack had chosen him, if they truly saw something in him worth trusting, then he had to at least try to understand. The thought filled him with a mix of determination and dread. Jake wasn't a hero. He was just a man trying to live a quiet life. But the memory of the puppy's fragile body in his arms during the storm kept surfacing, a silent reminder that he had already taken the first step into this world, whether he liked it or not. At dawn, Jake packed his gear, warm clothes, food, a compass, and the rifle slung over his shoulder. He pocketed the stone, feeling its weight settle against him like a promise. The forest was vast, and the pack could be anywhere. But he knew their tracks were out there, faint impressions left behind in the snow. He just had to find them. The first day was grueling. The snow was deep, the air biting cold, and the silence of the forest was oppressive. Jake scanned the ground for tracks, his boots crunching through the snow as he followed faint trails that led nowhere. He kept moving, driven by an instinct he didn't fully understand. He camped that night beneath the shelter of a rocky overhang, the fire he built doing little to chase away the chill in his bones. As he lay awake, staring up at the stars, he wondered if he was chasing a ghost. Maybe the pack had moved on, vanished deeper into the wilderness where no man could follow. But he pressed on. By the second day, exhaustion had set in. His legs ached, his breath came in ragged bursts, and the weight of his pack dug into his shoulders. The forest seemed endless, an unyielding maze of snow and trees. Jake began to doubt himself, his thoughts a whirlwind of frustration and self-recrimination. What was he doing out here? What was he hoping to find? He didn't belong in this world. He was just a ranger, a caretaker of trails and campsites, not some chosen protector of ancient lineages. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, Jake stumbled upon the first real sign of the pack. Tracks, larger and deeper than any he'd seen before, crossed his path. He crouched down, studying them, his pulse quickening. These were fresh. His heart hammered in his chest as he followed them, his pace quickening despite the burn in his legs. The tracks led him through dense thickets and across frozen streams, the terrain growing steeper with each step. On the third day, Jake reached the edge of a cliff. The forest opened up before him, revealing a breathtaking view of the valley below. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the snow-covered landscape. And there, standing at the cliff's edge, was the pack. Jake froze, his breath catching in his throat. They were majestic, their fur glinting in the sunlight, their bodies strong and lithe. The alpha stood at the center, its massive frame commanding attention. The other dogs flanked it, their eyes fixed on Jake as he approached. The air was electric, charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. And then he saw it, the puppy. It was no longer the frail, trembling creature he had carried through the storm. It stood tall and confident, its eyes bright and full of life. The crescent-shaped scar on its paw was still visible, but it no longer seemed like a mark of pain. It was a badge, a symbol of survival. The puppy broke away from the pack, bounding toward Jake with an energy that was impossible to ignore. Jake knelt as the puppy reached him, its small body colliding with his in a flurry of fur and excitement. It barked, a high, joyous sound that echoed off the cliffs. Jake couldn't help but smile, his hands reaching out to ruffle the puppy's fur. For a moment, the world fell away, and it was just the two of them, man and dog, bound by something neither could fully explain. The alpha moved then, its powerful frame cutting through the snow as it approached Jake. The other dogs followed, their movements fluid and purposeful. Jake's smile faded as the alpha stopped just a few feet away, its piercing eyes locking onto his. The weight of its gaze was almost unbearable, and Jake felt his chest tighten. This was no ordinary animal. The intelligence in its eyes was undeniable, and Jake felt as though it were looking straight into his soul. The alpha dipped its head, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a shiver down Jake's spine. It was an acknowledgement, a gesture of respect that Jake hadn't expected. The other dogs followed suit, their heads lowering in unison. Jake's throat tightened, his breath catching as he realized what was happening. They were accepting him. The puppy barked again, its tail wagging furiously as it nudged Jake's hand. He looked down at the little creature, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. This tiny, fragile life he had saved was now part of something far greater, something he was just beginning to understand. Jake stood slowly, his eyes meeting the alpha's once more. He didn't speak. There were no words that could capture the enormity of the moment. The alpha held his gaze for a long time before turning away, leading the pack back toward the cliff's edge. The other dogs followed, their movements silent and precise. The puppy lingered, its eyes full of gratitude as it looked up at Jake. And then it, too, turned and followed the pack, its small frame disappearing into the snow alongside its family. Jake stood there for what felt like an eternity, the cold wind biting at his skin. He felt raw, exposed, as though the pack had stripped away every layer of doubt and fear and left him standing bare before the truth. He had been chosen, not by Ela, not by the strange symbols on the stone, but by these creatures who saw something in him that he couldn't yet see in himself. As the pack vanished into the distance, Jake felt a sense of purpose settle over him. It was heavy, like the weight of the stone in his pocket, but it was also steady, grounding him in a way he hadn't felt in years. He turned back toward the forest, the trail ahead uncertain but no longer aimless. The pack had acknowledged him, and now it was his turn to live up to that trust.